So China's got pretty bad geography, but they also have a demographic collapse issue that seems
Worst
like,
in the world.
and I'm going to do a whole show on demographic collapse, so we can just be brief with it and do like a 10,000 foot overview. But this is the worst. You said the worst demographic collapse in the world, and that does. I assume that even includes Russia, which is currently throwing all of its any young man it can get into a war that it's not going to win.
It doesn't just include Russia; it includes the Black Death.
Oh, wow.
It's like the worst ever. Part of this is policy. You're familiar with the one-child policy. You do that for 40 years, you start running out of 30-year-olds. That's how math works. But most of it just has to do with development. When the United States started industrializing and urbanizing, we started back in the early 1800s. And so we have had generations to adapt to a more urbanized environment. And so we have this middle step where we went from farms to small towns to big towns to cities, and the cities have suburbs. And so there's always been a degree of elbow room put into the American model, which lowers the opportunity cost of having children. China didn't start to urbanize until 1980. And then they did it all at once. So people in a single generation went from living on a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo. And so they went from having 7 kids to 1 kid in 1 generation. The one-child policy was on top of that. And now that it's been more than 40 years, they don't have a lot of people aged under 40. There's no one left to have the next generation. So this was always going to be the last generation for the People's Republic. It was always going to be a 2-generation experience total. But it's happened so fast that we don't even have an economic theory developed. Humankind does not have an economic theory for what would allow the Chinese economy to function in 2030. It's that far gone.
Really? Look, when I hear things like that, I go, okay, well, if people in the U.S. are having fewer kids, it's not that bad. Also, we have immigration, right? We say, hey, we need more young, skilled laborers. Come on in. And we offer a bunch of, what is it, a J1 or an H1B? I always forget what these visas are. And we get a bajillion applicants, and tech companies in Silicon Valley and companies all over New York and elsewhere just pick from the cream of the crop. And the problem is kind of solved, isn't it?
In the United States, we are a large population, 330 million. In order to round out our younger age groups, we really need to bring in about 2 to 4 million immigrants a year. And we're well under that right now, and that is something that will come back to bite us again and again and again in the decades to come. But we're also a settler society. None of us are actually from here, and so the United States is capable politically of sustaining large volumes of immigration for an extended period of time. Just now is not one of those moments.
Native Americans are going to email me and be like, actually, and look, most of us are not actually from here. How's that?
Fair enough. Most of our descendants are not from here.
Right.
Or most of our antecedents, excuse me.
Right, antecedents, yeah.
Immigration can be part of our solution. There's a lot of complications in that conversation, politically, logistically. That's a different conversation we can get into if you want to. But the United States is the largest economy in the world with the greatest upward mobility from people from the lower classes to the higher classes. And the attractiveness of that system, especially since it's mostly free, is robust. And you're right, that when we do decide to have an open immigration system, we usually have no problem drawing in people. And that's before you consider what's about to happen to the wider world, where the delta between the U.S. and everyone else is going to be huge. So that is...
We'll get to that in a second. Yeah. We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
I definitely want to hear about that. I'm curious, though, that people will say, well, how come China can't just change their immigration policy and bring in a bunch of skilled people? They might even be able to offer better incentives than the United States. I disagree with that statement, and I'm pretty sure you do as well.
I would say there's 3 reasons that won't work. Number 1 is scale. The United States has over 300 million people. The Chinese have about 1.3 billion. So to move the needle, you don't just need to bring in 3 times as many people. You need to bring in 10 times as many people under age 40. It's not clear that there are enough people that are potentially migrant to salvage just China, assuming no one else moves anywhere else. Number 2, the United States has has developed an interesting reputation of late of being a little bit racist, with white people being a little sketchy. But in China, which is 90% Han Chinese, they are blindingly racist to anyone who is not Han. And to think that there are going to be incentives that will draw people, especially in numbers, to the PRC is ridiculous, even before you consider the disconnect in terms of economic activity. But third, there's the governing system. The US may be a flawed democracy, but a democracy it still is. China is a country where you are welded into your room when there's a health crisis. Just the degree, the casual dismissal of the very concept that private citizens have agency or interests is something that does not attract migrants.
Yeah, if I'm looking for a place to move, my life would have to be pretty bad. Well, first I'd apply to a place like the US or Europe because I can walk around freely. My life would have to be really bad to go, okay, I know that people die in fires from being welded into their house, and I know that they read all of my messages on my phone. I mean, I would have to be in a place like maybe Guatemala or Honduras, in a poor area where drug cartels and criminals are running roughshod over my physical safety in order to find a place like China better than my current lifestyle.
Well,
so
the
calculation just
Cuba,
changes.
Mexico, or the United States first.
Right, of course. Yeah, of course. So that's a problem then. And I think people don't realize that you can't just flip an immigration switch even in places with the infrastructure and the culture of immigration. It's hard to change. In a place that doesn't ever have it, it's going to be kind of a Herculean task.
Yeah,
to
China
fill that
has
gap.
never had net inward migration. It's always been outward, people trying to get out, not people trying to get in.
Huh. Did not know that. I assumed at some point they would have had inward migration, but maybe you have to go back like 2,000 years or something like that to find that.
Now, there
Not
is
even then?
migration
Wow.
within the Chinese system. People forget that China is not a traditional nation state. It is an empire, and they have expanded out and conquered other groups, and you do get migrant from those poorer minorities into the urban centers. But again, you can only do that once, because then you've hollowed out the countryside, and that is what has happened writ large throughout the entire system at this point.
So what is your prediction for how this plays out? You said this was morphing into something else. What happens here?
I'd like to riff off of some of the, some of the headlines I keep seeing, or some of the, news commentary I see. I think it really does a massive disservice to the protesters, because what I'm seeing now in, most media outlets is that the protests work to some extent because the COVID restrictions are coming down, or they're being morphed or changed or adjusted. And to a certain extent, that's correct, but it's actually the opposite of what's being portrayed. To an outside viewer that's going to look at a headline, I remember you sent me a headline the other day, right?
Yeah, the other day. I was like, hey, is this legit? It looks like they're capitulating. Not really.
The article you sent me isn't wrong, okay? The article you sent me is factual, but the headline is really throwing people off, because what it's doing in its own soft power way is convincing Westerners that China budged. China said, you know what? The people have spoken. The People's Republic of China have stood up and said, no more of this zero COVID nonsense. And the government listened and said, you know what, people? Yeah, we listened to you. And in fact, that's just not what's happened. What's happened is a massive last-ditch attempt to save face. What we are seeing right now, and I just want to go back to this, is mass arrests of anyone that went to the protests. Anyone that went near the protests are getting questioned. There are secret police and police busting down people's doors and arresting people that were holding up A4 sheets of paper. Busting down doors of people that put some graffiti up, or even just went to the crowd that was protesting against the zero COVID policy, right? This is what's currently happening and not being covered, because it's kind of akin to what happened to Tank Man. We don't talk about what happened to him afterwards. That's what's happening now. A massive, huge crackdown. The real bloodbath is happening behind closed doors, behind the scenes. The government is making sure that anybody involved wasn't listened to. They're punished. They're arrested, and their lives are over. They'll never be able to participate in society normally again, right? They'll never be able to join the government or get a state job or anything like this. So what's happening now is that the government is finding the best way to avoid this from happening again. They do not want to see more protests happen, Because what happens when more protests happen is maybe next time the police actually join the protesters.
Right.
Maybe next time the PLA and the riot police actually join with the people that are calling
People's
for
Liberation
the CCP
Army.
to step down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I can see this. New York Times, the article that I sent you, which we'll link in the show notes, and other major media outlets, they haven't really been talking about this. And let me know what you think here. Protests cannot be seen as a vector for change, just as you were saying. If the Chinese Communist Party changes course now, it looks like what they're saying is, all right, protests work. That's very, very bad for an authoritarian regime, right?
Yes.
Mainstream media, and I also hate that phrase, but they say the government can't be seen to be wrong. I get that. But I think in a media environment with censorship, without free speech, you can spin whatever you want. Come on.
Yeah.
You can spin that.
Yeah.
The bigger issue is now that people are asking for democracy and transparency and other rights of communication, and if they're protesting for zero COVID to end and they get their wish that way, let's say they get zero COVID to end that way, they go, wait a minute, protests work. So now why go home now? We got zero COVID lockdown to end. Let's keep talking about democracy and transparency. That sets a really, really bad precedent because then people will say, great, okay, so if we want more rights, all we got to do is throw a big national protest and we might get our way. Let's not stop at ending lockdowns. Let's get freedom like we failed to do in 1989. And that is the worst nightmare of the Chinese Communist Party, is people thinking that if they just actually fight the government, they can win, because they can. There's 1.4 billion people. I know a lot of them are in the CCP, but how loyal are you when you can actually have freedom? I mean, we're talking about a huge number of people. It's just, it could get very ugly very quickly if this gets out of control. And the way to get it out of control is to say that this might be effective.
Yeah, so it's a dual pronged approach. I think what we're seeing is the soft power they're allowing to proliferate in the West is to say, yes, Westerners, please believe we allow protests. In China, it's a show of force. It's to say, hey, the neighbor that went to the protest just got disappeared. Hey, there's a mass arrest right now in Guangzhou for anyone that held up a piece of paper, right, from between November 27th to December 3rd. If you were there, then you're getting arrested, right? That's what they're showing in China. So there's two different kind of displays. Now, what they're doing to save face for the zero COVID thing is, yes, they are rolling out massive changes, but they're not saying that zero COVID was a failure. They're saying that zero COVID was a success. These 3 years were necessary because what they found after all this time is that finally COVID morphed into something that wasn't dangerous. And actually, the top medical experts in the country have found out that COVID's not even COVID anymore. It's actually just a type of flu. So no one has to worry that much anymore. And it's a way of saving face because Omicron's been on Omicron for how long now, right? They've had state media go out there and say Omicron doesn't actually exist. It's actually super, super dangerous. And now the state media is saying, oh, actually, it's not that dangerous anymore. And now we can actually look at ways to kind of reduce some of the regulation and stuff. There's two things to take away from this. The government doesn't want to lose face and wants to justify what these 3 years of lockdown were. Simultaneously, the government wants to look like a hero for doing that and having all those measures in place for 3 years so that the people can say, oh, thanks for saving my life, government. And then the second thing is that they already got what they wanted. They got the control mechanism and actually instituted it in every single daily facet of life. Every single facet of life is revolving around government tracking and control and location services and QR codes. All of that stuff has been entrenched into society now. So the government does have a control mechanism for the future on from now to know and track every single citizen in the country. So it's almost like a win-win for them domestically, and then almost a soft power win for Westerners to look at the news and say, hey, maybe they actually gave in to the protesters.
So do we have a prediction for how this plays out? Because I know before we heard that they were going to pretend to budge, I think you and I agreed on this. We were going to say the Chinese Communist Party has to change course, but then claims victory, moves the goalposts, then covers up the deaths and the infection rates among the public for the next 3 to 5 years. And, that's so far so good, I guess, as far as my prediction being accurate. I wouldn't say it's good in any other way.
I think I wouldn't adjust that. I mean, that's where we're at. There's no way they're going to do anything else. I mean, they've already reported no deaths, right, from this. So we're going to be in a situation where it's just like the zero poverty, like the whole like Xi Jinping needs to go down in history for eradicating poverty. He gets on a podium and says, poverty's over. Did you hear, guys? Poverty's over. And everyone's like, what are you talking about? Like, there's no running water in this village over here. You know what I mean? There's abject poverty all over the countryside in China, but Xi Jinping made it illegal to say that there's poverty, because then the law is you're picking quarrels and starting rumors, right? This is what we're going to see with the COVID thing. There's not going to be any more transparency or any more opening up here. It's just going to be illegal to tell the truth. Just like always, there will be a government narrative. It'll be portrayed as this is how the government wants it to be seen going forward. And if you speak out against that, then you're arrested.
I was hoping we would have some positive news as a result of this, especially because we saw that article the other day about them potentially ending the lockdowns. But it just seems like we're still on the same course we were before with a fresh coat of paint.
I think really what it is there is some positive news, and that is the restrictions are being, relinquished to some extent. There is a lot of, it looks like it's going to happen throughout the country. I'm still talking to people that are like nothing has changed where they are, but it's, predictably a mess. There's very, very little continuity throughout China. It's really way more disorganized and messy and disconnected than people probably think, just because they consume so much of, China's propaganda that goes to the outside world. But what we're seeing is a huge mess. But I think the positive here is that, yes, the arbitrary, crazy, unbelievable, dystopian lockdown stuff is probably changing and going away. It's just that we're not really pointing the right blame. We're not pointing fingers at the right person. We're not blaming the right person. And I feel like China is really trying to alter history here and spin this in a way that, really serves their narrative and almost emboldens or empowers the top leadership. But I do have another prediction, and that's people aren't stupid in China. This might go away for a little while, and most people might be placated. But like you said, some people, educated people that saw through this, that knew that this was from the top, that were protesting for the right reasons, they're not going to change their mind and think that everything's okay anymore. And I think this could be the start of a very fragile and tumultuous time for the CCP.
I've heard a lot of experts postulate that Taiwan might get invaded in the next 5 years. And I'm always paying attention to this because my wife's family is from Taiwan. What do you think? And first, tell me what you think, but also, why the hell is Taiwan, this little island, so important to China? People ask me this all the time, and it's hard to explain concisely.
I mean, again, historically, when you believe that that this territory is fundamentally yours, it's a one China policy, and as a consequence, they've drawn a serious red line around it. They don't consider it foreign policy; they consider it domestic policy. They consider it the way the Americans would consider Texas, or other Americans would consider California. I guess it depends on the Americans you're talking to right now.
Yeah,
but
I
still,
was going to say.
The
Chinese Communist Party was never in control of Taiwan, but I guess if they're willing to draw their history all the way back through ancient China, then that's what they're doing.
And that's exactly what they're doing. So, look, it's very similar in the sense that, first of all, the Chinese understand that they have not been tested militarily the way the Russians have been in recent years. This would be an amphibious assault across a 100-mile strait, which makes it incredibly difficult to do against Western weaponry, if not direct soldiers, that would inflict a lot of damage. So there's a huge risk with the Chinese doing that, not to mention the fact that TSMC, which is the world's most important semiconductor producer, is utterly critical to Chinese advanced industry, and the Chinese manufacturers themselves are 2 to 3 generations behind the West in semiconductors. So the likelihood that the Chinese would willingly risk that in the foreseeable future is close to zero. But that doesn't mean that they won't nibble around the edges. And that's exactly what you saw after Pelosi. They said this is important, and so what did they do? They didn't provoke war, but they absolutely changed the status quo, and they will do that again. and again and again. Anytime they see the Americans or others providing them opportunity to shift the balance of power towards them, they're playing the long game, they're going to do that.
Yeah, they killed a lot of fish in the Taiwan Strait with their missile launches. I mean, I guess, yeah.
They put some sanctions on, too, some agricultural sanctions, sand, nothing strategically important, but very clearly drawing a line saying, this is the path we're going to go down, and every time you do this, we're going to make it hurt a little bit more. It's calibrated. It didn't risk war. The timing was very obvious. They knew the Americans weren't going to do anything in particular to respond because the Americans ostensibly were the ones causing offense with the Pelosi trip that Biden didn't support. I mean, this was a gift to the hardliners in China, no question. And there will be others. There will be others.
A lot of military experts say that the invasion of Taiwan is going to show a ton of buildup, ships, armor, etc., on the shores of mainland China. But in the book, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army colonels that wrote Unrestricted Warfare, they marveled at the U.S.'s use of helicopters in Desert Storm. I don't know anything about military strategy, but is there a scenario in which China or the CCP uses essentially a helicopter army to cross the 100-mile Taiwan Strait as opposed to slowly sailing across?
I absolutely believe that that's, what they're going to do. I mean, we've been so kind of preoccupied by the invasion force coming and I'm not saying that they're not going to use the maritime domain, but I do think that they are going to take advantage of air power in many ways. They're going to use ballistic missiles. They're going to use rockets, and they have so many weapons stored on their side of the strait. It would boggle your mind. They're going to use fighter jets. They're going to use bombers. They're going to use massive waves of helicopters for assaulting the island. I think the difference between, and this is the problem with people trying to take the Russia-Ukraine scenario and say, oh yeah, Russia thought they were just going to march in there and take over Ukraine. Russia's got an economy less than the size of Texas. And most of their stuff is old, and they tried to min run it because they had to, because that's all they had. The Chinese aren't going to do that. It's going to be massive. It's going to be overwhelming. It's going to be fast. When it happens, it'll be over like Iraq was, and it'll be mostly from the air because there is no way to drive a tank from the mainland to Taiwan, and amphibious assaults are extremely, extremely dangerous. In fact, it's widely believed that between the months of April and October, the sea states are the best time for invasion. So that's when they will come. I actually think that they're going to take advantage of the fact that, the Chinese would never invade now. The sea states are really bad, for that. That's exactly when they're going to come, and they're just it's going to be so overwhelming. People are going to be shocked, I think. It's going to be the same type of shock that the world was shocked when Desert Storm happened. I think everybody was put off by just absolutely flabbergasted by how fast America was able to subdue Iraqi forces and just wipe them out. That's what's going to happen when China invades Taiwan, and I'm afraid that what I'm more worried, quite frankly, in the aftermath. How are we going to survive as a nation when the Chinese say antibiotics are gone? Figure it out. Microelectronics, all the stuff. I mean, most of the stuff that makes up the products that you buy, if it's not the products themselves, comes from China. All that stuff, is liable to be cut off when this happens.
Yeah, it seems like if it comes from the air, it's going to be a lot less warning, a lot less time to prepare for the attack. It seems like you don't think Taiwan is very prepared for this. I read something about a military officer from Taiwan giving a talk, I think in China, saying, Taiwan doesn't stand a chance. If that's real, they should hang that guy for treason, but he might also be right. Not that he should have said it in China, but it's kind of scary. I mean, it doesn't seem like, not that they could repel an invasion force anyway, but is it even going to be that costly? Are they sort of keeping their eye on the ball over there? Do we know?
Well, I mean, it's just you've got 1.4 billion people. You've got the purchasing power parity. You've got the #1 economy in the world. You've got the ability to create all these weapons. You have been creating these weapons. You've taken technology from the United States. You now in some areas like AI, you lead in technology, and you've got an island of 23 million. right? That's doing great. The best chip manufacturers in the world. They own most of the chip manufacturing through Taiwan Semiconductor. Nothing to sneeze about, but it's 23 million people, and it's on a little island against, a massive mainland of 1.4 billion with all the resources of the #1 economy in the world. It's not shameful to say the Chinese are going to overwhelm Taiwan. It's just obvious. You wouldn't get mad because a 6'5", 300-pound man goes and stomps a toddler and say, well, that toddler should have been able to defend itself. Nobody would say that blame that on the toddler because he couldn't fight that. It's not, you're not disparaging Taiwan to say that they're not going to be able to stand up to Taiwan. And, so then it becomes, well, can they hold out long enough for the United States to get there? Get there and do what? Go to war with China, who has nuclear weapons, is not afraid to use them when they're talking about Taiwan? So are you gonna trade Taipei for Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. or New York? Probably not. So what are you going to go there to do? Probably evacuate people. Probably help, get them out, at least the ones that want to leave, just like they left the mainland in the first place. That's where I think, so when I'm kind of looking at this logically, it's not shameful to say this is going to happen, and it's going to happen very quickly, and we should be thinking about what are the implications. Not just that, of what happens to those people. I think 70-80% of the people are just going to want to stay there in Taiwan. They're going to become Hong Kong, right? They're going to become, another province of China. But there's going to be 20% or so that want to leave. We ought to facilitate their ability to leave and provide aid and comfort for those that are harmed in the invasion. But that's not shameful. It's just reality. And I think in our own domestic politics, we get hung up by this fact that we can't say that there's a peer adversary. There's a near peer adversary. Baloney. They are a peer. We're not even a near peer adversary when it comes to the amount of force they have on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. We are just there kind of, looking from afar saying, oh boy, I hope this thing doesn't go the way I think it's going to go, but it is. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that.
You don't think that the Ukraine situation dissuaded them because China can punch back so hard if we sanction them, and it's just not going to be an issue. Whereas Russia really couldn't. I mean, they can't really do much.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the problem with China experts. They're like, oh well, China's going to be deterred or dissuaded by X. That's not the way the Chinese Communist Party works. They look at a situation and they learn from it. Their goal is their goal. It's not. They're not going to say, "Oh, no, we're not, that goal is no longer our goal." No, it's still our goal. Oh, this is what America and the West did to the Russians when they invaded Ukraine. Okay, and they did. Last week of April, called in all the bankers from around the world. Okay, what happened? What do we do if we face these kinds of sanctions? So what are they doing? Just like they put in place the non-convertible currency and strict capital controls for the financial system, they're going to make sure that whatever sanctions we put in place are ineffective. So they're looking at that and they're learning, okay, what are all the things that we need to learn in terms of how the international order will respond to this, and then how do we ensure that that response is ineffectual? That's it.